I will I will continue reading Kampf, the second read. That day I just barely started and I read until the paragraph where Hitler is talking about his mother. So I'll continue. All this all this tended to make me something quite the reverse of a stay-at-home. I gave scarcely any serious thought to the question of choosing a vocation in life, but I was certainly quite out of sympathy with the kind of career which my father had followed. I think that an inborn talent for speaking now began to develop and take shape during the more or less strenuous arguments which I used to have with my comrades. I had become a juvenile ringleader who learnt well and easily at school but was rather difficult to manage. In my free time, I practiced singing in the choir of the monastery church at Lambach, and thus it happened that I was placed in a very favorable position. Placed in a very favorable position to be emotionally impressed again and again by the magnificent splendor of ecclesiastical ceremonial. What could be more natural for me than to look upon the abode as representing the highest human ideal worth striving for, just as the position of the humble village priest had appeared to my father in his own boyhood days. At least, that was my idea for a while. But the juvenile disputes I had with my father did not lead him to appreciate his son's oratorical gifts in such a way as to see in them a favorable promise for such a career. And so he naturally could not understand the boyish ideas I had in my head at the time. This contradiction in my character made him feel somewhat anxious. As a matter of fact, that transitory yearning after such a vocation soon gave way to hopes that were better suited to my temperament. Browsing through my father's books, I chanced to come across some publications that dealt with military subjects. One of these publications was a popular history of the Franco-German War of 1870 to 71. It consisted of 2 volumes of an illustrated periodical dating from those years. This became my favorite reading. In a little while, that great and heroic conflict began to take first place in my mind, and from that time onwards, I became more and more enthusiastic about everything that was in any way connected with war and military affairs. But this story of the Franco-German War had a special significance for me on other grounds also. For the first time, and yet as yet only in quite a vague way, the question began to present itself. Is there a difference, and if there be, what is it, between the Germans who fought that war and the other Germans? Why did not Austria also take part in it? Why did not my father and all the others fight in that struggle? Are we not the same as the other Germans? Do we not all belong together? That was the first time that this problem began to agitate my small brain, and from the replies that were given to the questions which I asked very tentatively, I was forced to accept the fact, though with a secret envy, that not all Germans had the good luck to belong to Bismarck's empire. This was something that I could not understand. It was decided that I should study. Considering my character as a whole, and especially my temperament, my father decided that the classical subjects studied at the Lyceum were not suited to my natural talents. He thought that the real school would suit me better. My obvious talent for drawing confirmed him in that view, for in his opinion, drawing was a subject too much neglected in the Austrian gymnasium. Probably also the memory of the hard road which he himself had travelled contributed to make him look upon classical studies as unpractical and accordingly to set little value on them. At the back of his mind, he had the idea that his son also should become an official of the government. Indeed, he had decided on that career for me. The difficulties through which he had to struggle in making his own career led him to overestimate what he had achieved. Because this was exclusively the result of his own indefatigable industry and energy. The characteristic pride of the self-made man urged him towards the idea that his son should follow the same calling and, if possible, rise to a higher position in it. Moreover, this idea was strengthened by the consideration that the results of his own life's industry had placed him in a position to facilitate his son's advancement in the same career. He was simply incapable of imagining that I might reject what had meant everything in life to him. My father's decision was simple, definite, clear, and in his eyes it was somewhat to be taken for granted. A man of such a nature, who had become an autocrat by reason of his own hard struggle for existence, could not think of allowing inexperienced and irresponsible young fellows to choose their own careers. To act in such a way, where the future of his own son was concerned, would have been a grave and reprehensible weakness in the exercise of parental authority and responsibility. Something utterly incompatible with his characteristic sense of duty, and yet it had to be otherwise. For the first time in my life, I was then 11 years old, I felt myself forced into open opposition. No matter how hard and determined my father might be about putting his own plans and opinions into action, his son was no less obstinate in refusing to accept ideas on which he set little or no value. I would not become a civil servant. No amount of persuasion and no amount of grave warnings could break down that opposition. I would not become a state official, not on any account. All the attempts which my father made to arouse in me a love or liking for that profession, by picturing his own career for me, had only the opposite effect. It nauseated me to think that one day I might be fettered to an office stool, that I could not dispose of my own time but would be forced to spend the whole of my life filling out forms. One can imagine what kind of thoughts such a prospect awakened in the mind of a young fellow who was by no means what is called a good boy in the current sense of that term. The ridiculously easy school tasks which we were given made it possible for me to spend far more time in the open air than at home. Today, when my political opponents pry into my life with diligent scrutiny, as far back as the days of my boyhood, so as finally to be able to prove what disreputable tricks this Hitler was accustomed to in his young days, I thank heaven that I can look back to those happy days and find the memory of them helpful. The fields and the woods were then the terrain on which all disputes were fought out. Even attendance at the rear school could not alter my way of spending my time. But I had now another battle to fight. So long as the paternal plan to make a state functionary contradicted my own inclinations only in the abstract, the conflict was easy to bear. I could be discreet about expressing my personal views and thus avoid constantly recurrent disputes. My own resolution not to become a government official was sufficient for the time being to put my mind completely at rest. I held on to that resolution inexorably. But the situation became more difficult once I had a positive plan of my own which I might present to my father as a counter-suggestion. This happened when I was 12 years old. How it came about, I cannot exactly say now, but one day it became clear to me that I would be a painter, an artist. That I had an aptitude for drawing was an admitted fact. It was even one of the reasons why my father had sent me to rescue. But he had never thought of having that talent develop in such a way that I could take up painting as a professional career. Quite the contrary, when as a result of my renewed refusal to adopt his favorite plan, my father asked me for the first time what I myself really wished to be. The resolution that I had already formed expressed itself almost automatically. For a while, my father was speechless. A painter? An artist painter? He exclaimed. He wondered whether I was in a sound state of mind. He thought that he might not have caught my words rightly, or that he had misunderstood what I meant. But when I had explained my ideas to him and he saw how seriously I took them, he opposed them with that full determination which was characteristic of him. His decision was exceedingly simple and could not be deflected from its course by any consideration of what my own natural qualifications really were. Artist, not as long as I live, never. As the son had inherited some of the father's obstinacy, besides having other qualities of his own, my reply was equally energetic, but it stated something quite the contrary. At that our struggle became stalemate. My father would not abandon his never, and I became all the more consolidated in my nevertheless. Naturally, the resulting situation was not pleasant. The old gentleman was bitterly annoyed, and indeed so was I, although I really loved him. My father forbade me to entertain any hopes of taking up the art of painting as a profession. I went a step further and declared that I would not study anything else. With such declarations, the situation became still more strained, so that the old gentleman irrevocably decided to assert his parental authority at all costs. That led me to adopt an attitude of circumspect silence, but I put my threat into execution. I thought that once it became clear to my father that I was making no progress at the rescue, for weal or for woe, he would be forced to allow me to follow the happy career I had dreamed of. I do not know whether I calculated rightly or not. Certainly my failure to make progress became quite visible in the school. I studied just the subjects that appealed to me, especially those which I thought might be of advantage to me later on as a painter. What did not appear to have any importance from this point of view, or what did not otherwise appeal to me favorably, I completely sabotaged. My school reports of that time were always in the extremes of good and bad, according to the subject and the interest it had for me. In one column, my qualification read very good or excellent. In another, it read average or even below average. By far my best subjects were geography and even more so general history. These were my two favorite subjects, and I led the class in them. When I look back over so many years and try to judge the results of that experience, I find two very significant facts standing out clearly before my mind. First, I became a nationalist. Second, I learned to understand and grasp the true meaning of history. The old Austria was a multinational state. In those days, at least, the citizens of the German Empire, taken through and through, could not understand what that fact meant in the everyday life of the individuals within such a state. I'll stop here and I'll continue the third read someday in the future. See you.